Hi, I'm Adrian Hernandez, the Vice Dean and Duke School of Medicine, Director of the Duke Clinical Research Institute. And I'm pleased to host today's research conference as part of Duke's Research Week. So we've had a lot of great lectures through the week, and this will also fill that same aim of bringing people into Duke, sharing what they're doing that's expanding horizons in research. Also, just want to remind everyone, as a continuation of our Research Week, to please join our poster session, which will highlight advances that we are doing here at Duke and the best of the best, especially from our young investigators. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Lily Peng. So Dr. Peng is a physician scientist and product manager for Google Health. Her team works on applications of deep learning to increase the availability and accuracy of care, something that I know all of us care about, especially as we advance our initiatives around AI health. Some of our team's recent work includes building models to detect diabetic eye disease, predict cardiovascular health factors from retinal images, detect breast cancer and lung cancer from screening scans. You can easily imagine how these models will be very important as we go forward in terms of having a proactive healthcare system, and also how we can reach beyond the walls of traditional healthcare systems and even outside of the US. So before Google, Dr. Peng was a product manager at Doximity and a co-founder of Nano Precision Medical, a drug device startup. She holds a BS with honors and distinction in chemical engineering from Stanford and an MD PhD in bioengineering from the University of California, San Francisco. So Lily, thanks for spending time with us virtually. We had wished you were here in person to share with your experiences, but we'll go ahead and learn from you here through this program. And then just a reminder, as questions come up, please go ahead and place your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll call out those questions at the end of the presentation. And for the purposes of this presentation, we do have everyone on mute, and we are recording it so that people throughout our community can view it at a convenient time. So Lily, I'll turn it over to you.
I want to say thank you guys so much for having me. Last time I visited Duke was when I was interviewing for MD PhD programs, and I just really loved the campus there. So I'm also very sad that I'm doing this remotely. So today I am going to be talking about how we could democratize screening and diagnostics with AI. So as everyone knows, I'm a product manager at Google, and the thing that we know at Google is deep learning is all around us. There are many products at Google and that have billions of users that are powered by deep learning, from Translate to Photos to Gmail. And we've also seen this technology power other businesses and other places everywhere, so even outside of Google. So first, for this particular crowd, I'm going to go over what deep learning is, just to begin with. Deep learning is a subset of machine learning, which is kind of a certain technique in the whole field of artificial intelligence. And deep learning in particular, I know we've heard about it much more in recent years, but it's really not a new technology. It's a modern reincarnation of artificial neural networks, which were actually invented in the 1960s. And it's this collection of simple trainable mathematical units, so equations, that are organized in layers, and they work together to solve or model complicated tasks. So in general, with smaller data sets or limited compute, other non-neural net approaches work better. So now that we have computers that are thousands of times more powerful than we did in the 1980s and 1990s, this allows us to layer the neural networks and train models that are more accurate. So the more layers you have in that network, the more it's able to accurately model this complicated task. In addition to high accuracy, these networks can learn from raw data. And so explicit feature engineering is not required. So what I mean is that we don't actually have to specify rules, we just have the machine learn by example. So most of what we do in terms of model architecture in medical imaging is admittedly pretty basic. We use very standard machine vision model architectures, and sometimes even just pre-training with a large consumer data set of images. So in this case, photos of cats and dogs, and whose labels can be then generated by lay people. So we use the same idea for medical images. The difference is that the labels are then often rendered by medical experts or in some other medical context. And this technology has been shown to have huge potential for many healthcare challenges. So some examples in eye disease, in skin cancer, in breast cancer. And the best part about this technology is that it works in the hands of not only research scientists, but also undergraduates, business owners, and in this case, even high school students. So here's an example of a high school student. His name is Abu, and he built a detecting breast cancer model using TensorFlow. And so in the recent years, we've seen this huge increase in the number of papers at the intersection of deep learning and healthcare. So I did this really sophisticated analysis on PubMed, where I Googled deep learning and kind of looked at the healthcare space, and you could see this huge increase in papers. And given the adoption of deep learning-based technologies in consumer products, and this figure that shows how much we're doing in healthcare on the research side, one would expect that we would have many AI-enabled products in the healthcare space. But the translation into product has been quite slow. And so, why is there this gap between expectation and reality? Well, the translation of AI technologies into healthcare is clearly more challenging than it seems. And so today I'm going to cover 3 common myths in building and translating AI models that might be contributing to this gap. I'll spend a little bit of time actually going through the building part, just so that we have a context of what it takes to build the models, and then we'll talk about the 2 different gaps that we see in the translating section. So here's the 3 myths. The first myth is that more data is all you need for a better model. The second myth is that an accurate model is all you need for a useful product. And the third myth is that a good product is sufficient for clinical impact. And so we're going to unpack each of this one by one. Okay, so the first one, more data is all you need for a better model. So this is actually generally true, but the caveat here is that it's not about the quantity of data merely, it's about the quality of data. So I'm going to go into this a little bit more. Remember that slide where I said, we need labeled data, usually generated by experts, to train a neural net? Well, how we get the labels has a huge impact on the performance of the models. So I've grouped this in 3 major ways that we can go about getting the models. The first one is a single read, one doctor, one diagnosis, and this is actually what happens a lot of times when we get retrospective cases. It already comes with a potential diagnosis. A second way of doing this is multiple reads. So we have multiple opinions and either aggregate these opinions by majority vote or min or max, or actually we sit these folks together in an adjudication ensemble. So, and then the adjudicators then come up with a final grade. The third option is to use additional data from the case to get a better ground truth. So in this case, maybe a pathologist reading or multiple pathologist reading of a biopsy, or longer term outcomes such as survival. So in general, if you have the same amount of data, 2 is better than 1, and 3 is better than the other 2. And this is because the third one actually incorporates outcomes that we care about the most and is the most meaningful for the patient. So now the problem is getting enough data for 2 and 3, getting enough data for these become increasingly harder. So how do you balance the need for a large number of training examples, which is thousands of training examples, and these kind of high quality type of data labels? So I'm going to walk through an example. A few years ago, we set out if we could actually train a model to classify fundus photographs for an eye disease called diabetic retinopathy. And back in the day, we actually weren't sure that we could do this. So we were really trying to see if we could translate some of these technologies in the consumer space into the healthcare space. So I think a lot of folks know DR, like many other diseases, is graded on a multi-point scale, in this case, a 5-point scale. And at first, we tried using a single label. And that ended up not working really well. We found that doctors often disagreed on the same image. And so we got more labels. We ended up with 54 ophthalmologists providing labels, which is these ground truth diagnoses, for over 100,000 images. So this means that each image received somewhere between 3 and 7 labels. And the 7 were for folks, for images where we had a lot of disagreement. And then we use these images and labels to train this model using an existing neural net architecture called Inception. And the result was a fairly high performing model, and we published this result in JAMA in 2016. And one of my favorite figures that I feel like doesn't get enough play in presentations is figure 4, where we tested the size of the data set and the number of labels and how that affects algorithm performance. So what we find here, I'm going to go into detail again in the next slides, is that while in general more data is better, the key is actually high quality data and an efficient labeling strategy. So in panel A, we look at the algorithm's performance and how it varies with the number of images in the data set, and what would happen if you use smaller and smaller data sets for training. So in the x-axis, we have, the number of examples, and the y-axis, we have performance. And each dot represents a different model that was trained using that size of data. And we started off with a few hundred images and then go on to the full data set. And as you can see, the performance of the model plateaus around 50 or 60,000 images. And that means for this particular problem, a training set of 50 to 60,000 images that are well labeled could give you an algorithm with similar performance to our 130 full set. This also means that in the future, for similar types of problems, this is what we could aim for in terms of a good starting point. In panel B, we measured the performance compared to the number of images per grade. And the development set had an average of 4.5 labels per image. So what would happen if you had noisy or imperfect labels for each part of the development set? So in the development set, we generally divide into 2, where 80% of that goes into the train set and 20% goes into a tune set. Sometimes the tune set's called a test set, sometimes it's called a internal validation set. We just call it a tune set because we're training the model on one set and then reading out how well it does on the tune set. So we use a full data set in this case, and we subsampled the number of labels. And so when you see that decreasing the number of labels in the train set seems to have little impact on performance, but the algorithm's performance did seem to depend quite a bit on the accuracy of labels on the tune set. So the takeaway here was that given unlimited resources, given limited resources, we would probably invest in labeling the tune set, which is actually only 20% of the full data set. And so you could actually concentrate your resources into one part of the data set. So we applied this learning in subsequent papers, and where we used a much smaller tune set and did different types of labeling with that tune set. And this is an example of us doing this with adjudication with the tune set. And we were able to kind of get specialist level performance using this strategy. And so you could see in 2016, that model was kind of on par with generalists. And then in 2018, it was on par with specialists. And we were using this sort of labeling strategy. So here's another example of where we're using direct predictions in making kind of new discoveries and new diagnoses. So this is an example of the third case of labeling strategy. The other two were like kind of 1 and 2. So this is comparing the third case. So again, with eye disease, what happens is one of the things that we look for in diabetic eye disease is a swelling of the macula, so the central vision portion. And this swelling is is best seen in 3D, and it's really hard to see on 2D photos. So instead, what happens with physicians now is that we use yellow spots or hard exudates as a proxy for that kind of swelling. And unfortunately, this results in both false positives and false negatives. So here's a figure, the neural net's being trained on a 2D image, and the ground truth is generated by a physician looking at that 2D image. And of course, any model trained on this data can only perform as well as the training data. So in this case, the doctors with the 2D images. So here, instead of asking the AI to learn from labels that were generated by the 2D image and the doctor, we instead asked it to predict what a OCT, so a 3D scan, should show. So here, we did this with 10,000 patients. We determined whether or not they had had DME, so the swelling, based on an OCT, and then asked the algorithm to predict the answer if only given the fundus image. So the input's still the fundus image, but the ground truth label is now additional data. And we hypothesized that the algorithm could make use of some of the 3D information captured in the 2D image that human beings weren't able to do. And so you can see here's a graph on the right where the algorithm's in blue, and then the red dots are physicians' performance using the 2D images. And you could see that the algorithm actually outperforms the physicians in terms of being able to make a call around the 3D label. And the result is this is actually quite exciting for us because it suggests that we can do more with less equipment or less expensive equipment, right? And so in this case, we could maybe increase access to care by making it that you could actually do some of this with the 2D fundus camera rather than having to have the 3D OCT camera as well. The interesting thing about this is we also ran an experiment to figure out how the model was making these predictions. So we did a bunch of things. We do heat mapping, which is a way of figuring out where the relevant parts of the image. This is also an example of what we do, which is cropping the image. And so we crop the image based upon the disc and the macula, so two regions in the eye. And we cropped them in concentric circles based upon kind of how close we are to that landmark and then increasing that radius. And as you can see, then we train models based on these cropped images to see whether or not there's an effect in performance. So it's kind of like a knockout experiment. And as you can see, the signal actually primarily comes from the macula, the fovea, since we're able to make a pretty accurate prediction until key parts of that macula are cropped out. Okay, so in the previous examples, we talked about how deep learning can be used on the current state of the patients. The label was generated on additional information we had on that particular patient at that particular time. And we were thinking, we're really talking about using grading scales that physicians are familiar with, standard grading scales. And the interesting thing, if you consider this, is that grading scales are really just proxies of disease progression. And so, for example, when we say a patient with early disease, we really mean that the risk of progressing to end state is relatively low compared to someone with intermediate disease. And one of the great things, as I said, about machine learning is that we don't have to specify rules like, what kind of exudate you have to look for. We actually can give that outcome label to the neural network and ask the machine to figure out the features that might be relevant to that prediction. So it allows you to do something like this, where here's an example of a patient who progressed to end stage, in this case neovascular AMD, in a year, and here's an image of a patient who didn't, and then train an algorithm to predict the difference. This is some early results that we did with a particular data set, the ARIDS data set, where we compared two grading scales with the deep learning model. And we took eyes with intermediate disease and then trained on so at time equals 0 years, and looked at the outcome as a label at time equals 1 year. And we took all the eyes with intermediate AMD and predicted whether or not they'll progress to neovascular. So here's the results. We can see that on the 4-category scale, the AUC is 0.5. And that's expected because everyone had intermediate disease, so it'd be a coin toss to see who progresses and who doesn't. The 9-step ERIT scale, which is the clinical trial grading scale, did better as expected in predicting progression, and the AUC is 0.67. And then the deep learning model performed the best at 0.77 AUC. I think there are also subsequent papers that went on to show very, very similar results. So this is a really promising result that suggests that there is more information in these data that we could utilize to come up with better grading scales. And you could see as this can be really applicable to lots of other diseases as well. So, and this is again with small, quote unquote small, relatively small data set of a few thousand patients. And so we could see that with a good labeling strategy, good labels, we can really do some really, I would say, magical things with this new technique. Okay, so that's the first myth. I hope I've convinced you that it's not just about the quantity of data, that it's also about the quality of data. So I'm going to move on to the second myth, which is that an accurate model is all you need for a useful product. So, really, I think the main message here is it's not just about accuracy, it's really about usability of the product. So taking a step back, building a machine learning model is really just one step in building a model that prevents disease or prevents blindness with AI. And this model actually needs to be incorporated to our product so that it can be used by doctors and nurses and other clinical staff. And so it's critical that we study how AI fits into a clinical workflow. This is an area where our team and others are really starting to gather that evidence of how we really need to go about designing a product. And in Thailand, here's an example. In Thailand, we are working with our partners, this Dr. Paisan, who leads one of the national screening program in the hospitals there at Rajaviti Hospital. We first conducted a retrospective validation study using, so there are 13 sites, 13 regions in Thailand, and there's a national screening program there. And there's a lot of retrospective data with, with grading that was already done. We actually regraded some of these images and we measured performance of the model against graders from that region to get an idea of what real life performance might be. And to make sure that the model that we had trained was generalizable to the population in Thailand. The training data from our model was from India and from the US. And so we didn't actually have patients from Thailand in the data set. So we did actually show that in late 2018, that the model is generalizable. And because of that result, we then launched a prospective study to evaluate the performance and feasibility of actually implementing AI into the existing DR screening clinics across the country. So in Thailand, screening is done in what they call NCD clinics, so non-communicable disease clinics. They take care of metabolic disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, et cetera. So these clinics are meant to be closer to patients rather than the central hospital. And so earlier this year, we closed recruitment of 7,600 participants from these sites, all of whom were screened using AI. And here are the 9 sites. There were nine different sites in 2 different regions in the country. We're analyzing the data, both qualitative and quantitative, but we found that this kind of mapping out the workflow was critical in understanding what were true blockers of implementation, and it's not necessarily model accuracy. So here's an example of things that we've done in the study. So what we've really learned is that the human-centered approach is really key for building useful products. We sent and worked with what we call HCI, human-computer interface experts, and user experience, user researchers to understand the feasibility of using AI within the screening program. So here's a map of each step that a patient has to go through from the time they present at a clinic to the time they exit. At the same time, we're also mapping, what the nurse is doing and what the consulting ophthalmologist is doing. And it really helps us identify potential efficiencies and bottlenecks as we implement the workflow in the software. And we also we published this methodology in a recent paper in CHI Proceedings, where we are not only looking at product functionality, but how we maximize, workflow. So like the patient comes in, How many times do we attempt imaging before we use dilation drops? How many times do we, what are the conditions where maybe we use dilation drops right away? How do we also fit in their other types of care? So they're here presumably for diabetes. There's nutrition and counseling. There's a bunch of other things that could be happening while they're waiting. So there's a lot of factors that go into making this efficient for both the patients and the providers. Okay, so this brings us to the last myth, which is a good product is sufficient for clinical impact. And in fact, we also have to address what this product's impact is to the healthcare system. And the truth is, we can have the best product in the world, but if patients don't have access to it, we have really done very little, right? So, and what are the reasons why people don't show up for screening at all, AI powered or not, right? There are many. One of the reasons that we've heard time and time again is that the logistics of presenting to care is actually pretty difficult. So in this case, we did some work in India, and for many patients, a trek to the central hospital can take an entire day. And that means, someone to take care of their children or their loved ones, and coping with lost wages, because, in India, a lot of folks, you don't work for that day, you don't get paid. There's not really anything called, paid time off type of thing. And so screening facilities closer to patients, putting screening facilities closer to where patients live mean that they can easily and more efficiently access this care. And they don't have to choose between, kind of getting care for themselves and providing for their loved ones. So this is actually one of the critical things that we learned and we're trying to explore in India is what are the sites where we're able to increase the amount of adherence to not just screening guidelines, but follow-up. And I'm talking about India specifically, but we've also seen this in the US. We've worked with FQHCs and other places where screening rates are actually quite low. And we've seen an increase in screening and follow-up rates. Actually, the surprising thing was, for me, was the screening rates were low, but I thought the follow-up rates would be higher if we told someone, hey, you got sight-threatening disease, that there would be motivation for the follow-up appointment. And we actually found that some of these sites' follow-up appointments were dismally low. And so what we did was we actually started running a study where we would give same-day diagnoses, not AI-enabled, actually, people, human-enabled, actual intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. And we saw follow-up rates just for same-day screening to increase 3 or 4-fold in terms of follow-up rates. And so this is actually really, really telling for us, which is the thing that AI can enable is not just more accurate care, but more timely care. And that makes a big difference in terms of the outcome that we're looking for. And so the last part I kind of want to cover is the cost effectiveness research that is critical to adoption. This really includes how a product should be implemented to take into account the downstream effects. So referral rates is one downstream effect that we think about, but also, treatment, right? Like, can we treat the patients that need to be treated? In some places, so the standard of care for, DR is injections. In some places, injections is just not feasible, and so we have to do lasering. Right, and so when you choose one or the other, that actually makes a difference on how much that costs to the system. And so this is an example of work that has been done by another team in Singapore, the Singapore Eye Research Institute. And they actually published a paper recently in the Lancet showing the results of an economic modeling study comparing 2 deep learning approaches, an automated and a semi-automated approach. So the semi-automated approach actually had human assessment within the Singapore DR screening program. And what was interesting about this was that the semi-automated or assistive approach actually was the most cost-saving, not the actually more so than either the AI alone or a human alone. So in some cases, a combination approach, you're going to see a better cost effectiveness than a single one, and sometimes better performance. We've actually had some research that shows the human plus AI together actually get to even a more accurate diagnosis. So in any case, this is really, really exciting to see some of this research coming out. I anticipate that there'll be a ton more, and it'll probably really inform some of the operating points of the model and how the model will need to be designed and the product will need to be designed to really get the maximum value out of it. Okay, so the 3 common myths in building and translating AI models. I hope I kind of demystified a little bit of it. There are probably a ton more blockers than just the ones here. But the 3 major ones are more data is all you need for a better model. And here, we really talked about label quality and ground truth is really critical to building an accurate model. And then the second one is that an accurate model is all you need for a useful product. And this is where we've seen that a human-centered approach is required to build a useful product, not just the accuracy part. And then the last one is a good product is sufficient for clinical impact. And what we have found is that the implementation science and the health economics research is critical to the adoption of AI products and especially the scaling of AI products. Okay, all right, any questions?
All right, Lily. Hey, thanks. That was a terrific presentation and a quick overview of how lots of things have happened over the last several years. So just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions, go ahead and put it in the Q&A, and then I'll use those questions to guide some of the conversation. So Lily, first let me just start off with, you talk about data in terms of quality. And that's, foundation. And also, there is a mix of quantity. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about longitudinal changes. In some cases, people develop models and then they stop. And so like, this is the answer, eureka. And we know that populations change. There are other factors that change over time. What's the approach here for AI and diagnostics here for accounting for that issue, or recalibration, et cetera? So.
So let me make sure I understand the question. It's really around continuous learning. So how do we update the model as it gets more information?
Valid. I mean, the nice papers you highlighted illustrate like how there's tuning internally, and then also validation with some specific cohorts. But how? What happens in say 2 or 3 years with this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that we really think is great about these models is that the more examples you're giving to the models, the better it gets. And so there's a balance between kind of being able to report out with the performance of that model and having that model stable as it's being distributed versus continuous kind of improvements. And so what we've actually, our approach has been really model freezing. So you freeze a model and then so actually every time I say we're updating a model, really what we're doing is training a new model. So it's not like it's the same model that gets updated per se. I guess it's really you get more training data and then you train a model that has using the same architecture with more data. And so I think it's not that different from the way that we ship software. Is that like you have a version, you ship it, you get more data, you understand the model's weaknesses and the performance weaknesses. We have post-market monitoring, et cetera, that's in place. And then you update that model. And so one of our APIs has a CE mark. And so that's the model that actually is being used. And then periodically, when you get more data and more information, we update that model and we submit a CE, an update, and then that update gets shipped. So it's kind of a continuous process. So there's like little checkpoints that we use as the model kind of, as we get more information about real life performance. And this is why we do the retrospective validation before we do a lot of prospective stuff, just to make sure that based on at least the retrospective data, we have pretty high confidence that this model will work well in this population.
Okay. So kind of another question kind of tied to your human-centered approach is that there can be situations, and especially in screening and trying to screen, especially large populations, where people can pick up signals or incidental findings that actually treatment may be more harmful. And so kind of a classic story is, was written a number of years ago in the New Yorker, where thyroid cancer was blossoming in terms of an issue in Korea, and they decided they were going to tackle it. And the story was that when they decided they were going to 100% screen and 100% treat, it didn't change outcomes. In fact, there was more harm in some areas. And so that's one of the worries about getting to this imperceptible data and making it perceived and acting on it. How do you all approach in terms of the decisions of where you are going to put effort for diagnostic algorithms and testing?
Yeah, so there are two approaches, I think. The first one is really being very careful about screening programs that we work on for scaling, right? So I think about work that we do to scale something and work that we do for discoveries or new things, right? So for scaling, we think about programs where there's a lot of evidence for cost effectiveness, for effectiveness at a population level. So DR, diabetic retinopathy screening, is one of them where we have a lot of evidence for both. There are well-known scales that are agreed upon. And the model is asked to do a pretty narrow prediction, which is like, what's the level of DR? It doesn't do incidentals and other kind of things. And as you can see, what we've seen is that a hybrid approach between kind of a human and a model seems to do better in some of these cases. So that's one thing on the scaling side, is being pretty careful about the work that you do in terms of so like scaling, thyroid cancer screening. I don't know if there's great evidence, globally and agreement globally that the outcomes that we're looking for are there. So it would be something that we probably won't work on the scaling side. But on the discovery side, I think that's kind of interesting in that you can discover sort of these new associations, and in fact can actually help a little bit if we actually use outcomes as a label, can help a little bit with these incidentals, right? So there's some toleration for incidentals that don't affect, you have a nodule in your lung, it's never going to bother you. You're going to die with it, not of it. And so that becomes part of the training example. And that's part of the nulls or the negatives, right? And so the model can then pick up the difference between a nodule that, will do nothing versus a nodule that will really have progressed into a cancer. So that's the hope. I think there's a lot more that, so we've seen some early results where the model is able to ignore some features that we know are not, that are probably, features of benign states, but I think that's kind of the newer thing that these systems can do. Now, that discovery part really only brings us so far, right? Then there's some work that needs to be done in terms of validating this, in terms of running the clinical trials prospectively, and that sort of thing. Another approach that we've seen that might work is looking at diseases within the same classification. So the example that I gave in AMD, we looked at everything in every patient that had intermediate disease. So, you can imagine like, stage 2 colon cancer has some similar characteristics where, we don't know how the patient will progress. And the AI model is able to kind of give you hypotheses of people who are a little bit on the more severe end of that spectrum and some people who are a little more on the benign end of the spectrum. And you can actually look at the features that make a difference for these folks. So the discovery phase is pretty early. It's used as the discovery tool. And then like any other discovery of features that may be, predictive of progression or not, you'd really want that randomized clinical trial and that are prospectively run before you use that. Great.
Well, let me ask some other questions that have come in, and I have some harder ones for you as well. So we'll just get you ready for that, especially around, I want to cover some of the ethical considerations that we're facing here. So, so one that came up is in most diagnostic studies, there's inter and intra observer variability that can be quite large. And so you talked about achieving consensus among interpreters, because that becomes a ground truth. How do you actually know that? and what is too much intravariability that can't be useful. So do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, I think obviously the perfect, not perfect, but the better answer to, doctors grading with the information we have now is understanding the outcome of the patient, in a year's time, 2 years time, 10 years time. And the problem is like that type of data is much harder to come by later on, right? Sorry. And so what we try to do in terms of, getting the data, getting the doctors to agree on a diagnosis is, one second, let me cough. Sorry, that's a longer time than I expected to talk. Anyway, or that I'm used to. I did expect a long time to talk. So I think what we try to do is we both monitor intergrader and intragrader discrepancy. So we'll give the same rater the same case, and we'll try to see what the agreement is over time. And what I think of is the integrator discrepancy is probably the highest kind of bar, or not the highest bar, the highest level of integrator agreement we can get to, right? So if the same person isn't consistent with that with himself, then getting them to be more consistent with other people is that's just noise, right? You're not going to get that. So we both test in intragrader, so we give the same image dispersed throughout the grading to the same graders just to see what that level is, and then we look at the intergrader between graders. And then we also find that we do these adjudication rounds where there's a group of folks sitting around. They don't have to be synchronous, but they do discuss cases, and this is where you'll have a minority opinion really kind of end up getting could become the majority opinion or the adjudicated opinion because somebody's picking up on something subtle that the other graders have missed. So that's why we think the adjudication work does better than the single grade. And if you could, everyone would get multiple opinions, and that would be the gold standard. But we don't have the luxury of doing that, so that's why we do the different kind of labeling strategies. And then some of what we do sometimes is then measure some of these grading pods against each other. So one adjudication group versus another adjudication group to look at the maximum performance there, and then we can look at these pods or individual graders compared to the outcome and how the grading groups actually are able or not able to compare to some other ground truth. And that's kind of how we measure the different types of grading schemes that we have.
Okay, great. Now, I think all of us, appreciate or think that, if we can move from human intuition to human intelligence through AI, that it will be more cost effective. And it seems like that you're starting to illustrate that. Do you have any explanation about why that may be the case? That that there's some people talk about, well, there's this clinician model and then there's just this AI model, but you seem to are underscoring it may be combined. Is that really the most cost effective way, or should we just let computers take care of people over time?
Yeah, I think this is it speaks to the complexity and diversity we actually see in healthcare, in humans, and in diseases. So I've been reading this book called Range, where they talk about how there's literally a section in there where they talk about narrow intelligence and kind of more generalized intelligence. And I really think AI is quite good at narrow intelligence. So you have a task that needs to be done, that has been done 10,000 times before, and you just kind of don't want to do the 10,000 first and 10,000 second, et cetera, right? So you train an AI to for problems where the rules are pretty well known, and what the book calls a benign world or a kind world, where so chess, for example, or even Go is actually a kind world where we understand the rules. And in some ways, DR is a little bit of a kind world in terms of diseases, because there's all this literature that talks about, at level 45, there's a progression rate of this and that, right? So we've as humans actually run a bunch of trials to make this kind of grading task kinder than most. But what we see in medicine is that a vast majority of problems is what the book called wicked worlds, where the rules of the game are kind of unknown, right? So I can even give another example in eye disease, which is like glaucoma, right? Where it's a little bit more wicked because we don't, like, there are some disagreements on, what do you do with glaucoma suspects? While there may be agreement in vision loss, right? And for glaucoma, there's less on the earlier parts of the disease. And you could see in many diseases, we're talking about a very, wicked world. Like, is this atypia in the breast tissue going to progress or not? We don't actually understand the rules for that. And for things like that, it's just this kind of generalized intelligence, which is what humans have, work a lot better, where you can learn to grade images with a few, 100 examples even, or dozens of examples, where humans can actually learn this pretty quickly. There's no way this kind of neural net can do that, right? So you kind of have strengths on both sides, which is in medicine, there are some problems that are quite kind and we actually know the rules, and we can actually train other folks to do a lot of this work, right? Like, so we actually have technicians that can be trained to do these rote tasks. But you could see that AI, once the rules are known, you apply that AI tends to do better. It's similar to like why you don't do long division anymore, because there's a calculator that does it much better than you can and more reliably. But you don't assign tasks in a wicked world to AI because it wouldn't function in that world. And so I think it speaks to how medicine actually is constructed, is that we have a blend of problems and we handle these problems very differently. So what I think has been useful is I've seen places where there's AI can express uncertainty. So there are some bunch of cases where the algorithm says, you know what, I've seen a lot of examples of this before. I'm pretty confident in my, analysis, and its uncertainty is low. And then there's a group of examples where you give the case to the AI and the AI is like, I've never seen this before, right? And that's where it should be kicked out to a human, because it is something that is outside the scope of what this particular tool is able to handle.
Okay, great. So the next question has to do with more the implementation. So so a group here has developed really novel tools around detecting or screening for autism. And the thing that's troubling is that after a positive screen, follow-up is poor. Like, what are there things that you all have found, through what you've done in terms of, yes, it's important to screen and get to kind of an early diagnosis, and how do you increase the so-called next steps? So just getting that answer is not the so-called end answer, but it's actually what's next. What matters there?
Yeah, so this is this is something we're learning ourselves too, because we come from kind of the AI background, and this is really about human behavior and how do you get people to follow up on appointments.
It's like forecasting the weather. A hurricane's coming, get out of the way, but like unless you see it windy, people don't pay attention to it.
Yeah, exactly. It's so there's one thing about getting that forecast exactly right, and there's another challenge in getting people to evacuate, right? So I think this is a very similar thing. It's really about kind of human behavior understanding of what the diagnosis means to them, and I think what it seems like is that's all really about human connection and being able to communicate to the patient why this is important to them. I think oftentimes we communicate to them why it's important to us, why we think it should be important to them. That may not be what's important to them, right? So with DR, we say, well, it's important because you can lose your sight, right? But what they hear is, well, you could lose your sight, but and there's some small chance that I'll lose it. I mean, I'm not going to lose it right away. I'll have plenty of time to deal with this. It's not a quick disease. And what they hear is, I want you to come back because I want you to forego that extra day's worth of wages, or I want you to disappoint your daughter or son because you can't be there for this particular thing, or an elderly parent at home. And so they're hearing, okay, well, this isn't going to make me blind right away. And I have these other things I care about that are more important. And so I'm going to smile and nod and say, hey, I totally understand that this is important to you. But right now on the priority of things that it's important to me, I don't get it. And so I'm not going to do it. Now, if you can actually flip it and say, this is why it's important to you, because then you cannot, in the long term, take care of your family. This will impact the way that you're going to be able to work longer term. And oh, by the way, we can fit you in the same day so that you can just, your lost wages, we can decrease the amount of trouble this causes you by giving you that same day appointment. That actually then speaks to what's important to them. Right. So I don't know the specifics about the autism case. So I think, there's a lot more, I think, complications here. So I'm clearly simplifying the problem a lot. But that's kind of what we observed with the DR.
I just, and again, like just illustrating kind of some of the issues about behavior that has to be accounted for. So next question, which is probably something could be, all day discussion, but really has to do with an ethical conundrum. And so as you illustrated, one of the things that's really important for these methods is to have large, high quality data. And so if we just use something that we struggle with at Duke, we are a reasonably sized health system, but just using some of the numbers, we wouldn't necessarily have all the numbers you have in terms of how do we develop machine learning for something and some imaging. It really would go faster or and way better if there was multiple health systems working together with a huge data repository. So here's my question to you, like the kind of ethical consideration. So from a societal perspective, having more data accessible for lots of smart people to use and develop predictive models would be potentially a societal good. And that could be turned into products that benefit patients, and there can be a model around that. On the other hand, there's this personal ethical consideration or conflict, which is whether individuals know that their health data is being used in this way, and would they be okay with it? So you can imagine from a society perspective, if we care about population health, preventing disease, acting on it, et cetera, that would be a public health goal. But then the privacy issue for individuals and how their data is being used. I know you all have thought a lot about this issue and how you're approaching it. Just some high level comments about the issue here that we're facing.
I think, so first of all, I do want to say thank you for raising this question. I actually think that this is something that is really important, but it is definitely something that I feel like we really need a group of folks thinking about, not just, like one group. Like I think I can represent sort of research perspective from the insides of a big tech company, but I think there's a lot of other perspectives that need to be represented here. So I think actually this is a much more in-depth conversation. But one of the things that I kind of want to point out is it's not I think a lot of times this is framed as a either or, like a zero sum, like either you're protecting, privacy or patient privacy or consent, or you are, looking out for them in terms of best outcomes. And I don't think necessarily that's the case. I think you can ask patients for consent. And this goes into that first principle, which is it's about the quality and the type of examples you're trying to get and what that does for the performance of the algorithm and understanding that trade-off versus just getting all the data in the world, right? So the way that I would say about this is that the trade-off for privacy is a little constant for people, right? In terms of like, you can, so each person you consent, we can make the consent easier, obviously, through electronic consents and whatnot. So we can clearly make the consents easier. But what we've seen is that in the training examples, rare examples, people with diseases it's more important to have more of those, right? So in population, 80%, 90% normal, it's really that 10 or 5%, and the 1% or 0.1% that have these interesting findings or edge cases that you don't want to miss. And so those are the people that we really need to get consent from, right? So that actually a lot of these people are more than willing to donate the data that they have for good, because they have ongoing disease, they want to help other people, they're enthusiastic. You can even see, in the breast cancer community, right? There's a ton of folks who have disease who are more than willing to contribute to their data to research. And then there are people who have loved ones who have this disease, who are healthy controls and willing to present. Those are the people that make the biggest difference in terms of getting consent and contributing to research. And those are the people where the trade-off for them is, I can help research this. I will give consent. For me, this is important that my data should go into a repository. And there's a lot of people who have normal, they're normals, and we have a lot of examples of normals. So we don't need a whole lot of them, right? So I think there's a strategy here in terms of, obviously, if you consent everyone, that would be fantastic, right? But really, the people who are returning to care and having often, like frequent interactions with the healthcare system, those are actually more likely to, one, give consent, but also have data that is meaningful to other patients, right? And so I think there's a strategy around, which patients to talk to get them to understand the power of what we can do with their particular data. And then there's a strategy to kind of having agreements between different institutions to kind of share this type of data, because it's really quite critical for not only research, but also clinical care. So I'm, again, simplifying everything. But I do think that there are, I don't think it's necessarily an either or. I do think it's understanding how to communicate this to patients, and understanding that and incorporating them in this process of developing AI.
Great. And just last minute before we end, any advice for people in academia interested in this field in terms of what to do for their careers?
So many ways of doing this. I think, I would say one is, if you are interested in the technical aspects of this work, Google has a bunch of, tutorials, TensorFlow tutorials, if you want to kind of, use the tools yourself. I know there are other frameworks out there too, and they're just as easy to use. So look at those as well. And then if you're not, and a lot of clinicians are quite busy, but part of it is then working with computer scientists that are kind of within, Duke is great because you've got kind of very, well-rounded different types of, especially engineering departments, right? So working together across disciplines has been really critical. And I think even at Google, our team is pretty multidisciplinary. And so actually figuring out how to do that, I think, is great. And then approaching each other with humility, because a lot of times we think we know what the other person's talking about, but we really have no idea. And so that particular context has been pretty critical, I think, to approach each other with humility there. So.
All right. Well, we're at the end of our hour here. So Lily, thanks so much for spending time with us and the fabulous talk and discussion here. So thanks everyone for joining our conference here today. So Lily, thanks again. What a terrific talk and discussion.